Have you ever wondered why so many paternal grandmothers, who once held their grandchild's hand, whispered lullabies and shared smiles, eventually fade into the background of memory? Why do some children grow up barely recalling the woman who shared their father's blood, who once longed to be an integral part of their lives? Freud once said, "Nothing that roots itself in a child's psyche disappears without leaving a trace." In the world of family, those early traces either build bridges or carve canyons, emotional gaps that last a lifetime. And in the case of the paternal grandmother, that gap is often silent, invisible, and deeply misunderstood. This is not about overt conflict or dramatic rejection. It's about subtle forces, unspoken loyalty, buried fears, inherited roles, and emotional currents that move below the surface. Today, we explore why so many paternal grandmothers end up distanced from the grandchildren they love, despite their best intentions. In early life, Freud believed the mother is the first emotional anchor. She is the infant's earliest symbol of safety, nourishment, and love. And when a baby arrives, helpless, demanding, and deeply dependent, the new mother, exhausted and overwhelmed, reaches instinctively for her own mother, the one who, in her subconscious mind, represents comfort and guidance. And just like that, without ceremony or planning, the maternal grandmother steps in. She's there for the baby's first baths, the midnight cries, the confusing fevers. She's the warm soup, the steady hands, the presence that reassures. She doesn't knock, she arrives. She doesn't ask, she steps in. And as she cares for her daughter, she also bonds with the grandchild, not just through big gestures, but through quiet, constant presence. Meanwhile, the paternal grandmother may be just as loving, just as eager, but her position is different. She calls before visiting. She asks for permission. She offers support, but always as a guest, not an extension of the core. And by the time she holds the baby, the bond between mother and child and maternal grandmother is already deeply forming. This difference of timing becomes a difference of emotional memory. Freud called this repetition of the primary pattern. A mother, in nurturing her child, unconsciously repeats the model of care she received. If her bond with her own mother was secure, she invites her in. But if the relationship with her mother-in-law carries even a hint of distance, formality, or unresolved tension, that gap widens in moments of stress, not out of malice, but out of instinct. Have you ever noticed how photos of a baby's first days often include the maternal grandmother cradling the newborn, while the paternal grandmother appears only later, when everything is calm? Have you seen how one visit feels like part of the routine, while the other feels like a scheduled appointment? To the adult eye, these are logistics. But to the unconscious mind of the infant, these moments encode meaning. Even before language, babies feel presence. They register who was there when they were hungry, cold, or afraid, who held them when they cried, who smelled like safety. Over time, this forms a silent truth. The maternal grandmother is constant. The paternal grandmother is occasional. And even if love is present in both, the depth of imprint is not equal. When, years later, the paternal grandmother tries to get closer, perhaps after retirement or once the child grows, she may feel an invisible wall. Not rejection, exactly, but an absence of shared emotional history. Her warmth is genuine, but it lands on soil that was once tilled by another. Freud reminds us, the first years of life shape how we love, how we trust, how we seek comfort. And when those years pass without a deep bond being formed, it's difficult, but not impossible, to change the emotional script. This doesn't mean the maternal grandmother is better or the paternal one is unworthy. It simply means that in the emotional blueprint of early family life, proximity matters. Familiarity matters. And the child's loyalty, deeply unconscious, often follows those first emotional footprints. If you are a paternal grandmother reading this, or the child of one, or even the parent caught between two generations, know this. The issue is rarely intentional. It's about patterns, echoes, invisible repetitions. But also know this. Awareness is power. In the next part, we'll explore how these unconscious dynamics continue to shape relationships across generations and what we can do to heal them. Imagine standing at the edge of a family gathering and watching your grandchild run into someone else's arms first, not because they love you less, but because something in their early wiring pulls them toward the other. This is the heartbreak many paternal grandmothers quietly carry. a feeling of being peripheral in a circle they deeply long to belong to. But how does this emotional geometry form? Why does one grandmother become the sun around which the family orbits, while the other fades quietly into a distant moon? To answer this, we must look deeper into the psychological triangle formed at the birth of a child: mother, maternal grandmother, and paternal grandmother. At its core, this isn't just about people, it's about power, identity, and ancient patterns of attachment. When a woman becomes a mother, she is thrust into a new identity, one that's often confusing, overwhelming, and transformative. In these early moments, the question that shapes her decisions is, who will support me in becoming who I now need to be? And instinctively, she turns to what feels safe and known: her own mother. This is not just practical, it's psychological. The maternal grandmother doesn't need to prove herself. She is already embedded in the daughter's emotional map. Her advice is heard, her presence is accepted, and her flaws are forgiven. She represents familiarity, not threat. But the paternal grandmother? She enters this equation from a different angle. Her presence, no matter how kind, is filtered through the lens of the other. She is connected to the partner, not to the woman's inner child. And in times of vulnerability, that distinction matters more than most people realize. Freud taught that we seek emotional symmetries. We are drawn to what mirrors our early attachments. A new mother, struggling to soothe her baby, isn't just managing a crying child. She's reliving her own earliest experiences of being comforted. And if her relationship with her own mother was nourishing, she'll pull her in. If it was fraught, she may unconsciously try to repair it through the grandchild. This is why, in many families, the mother becomes the gatekeeper, not maliciously, but instinctively. She determines who is let in and how close they're allowed to get. And this emotional border often places the paternal grandmother just outside the inner circle. It doesn't matter if both grandmothers are equally loving. What matters is who feels emotionally safe to the mother during her most vulnerable phase. Have you ever seen a mother ask her own mom to stay overnight during postpartum, but hesitate to make the same request of her mother-in-law? Or heard stories where one grandmother gives unsolicited advice and it's taken warmly, while the other says the same thing and it sparks tension? This isn't just personality conflict, it's attachment bias. Even well-meaning mothers might unconsciously restrict access, set different rules, or interpret intentions differently. My mom is just trying to help, she might say, but your mom is always interfering. Two identical actions, two completely different reactions. And over time, the child absorbs this dynamic. Children are highly attuned to emotional cues. They notice who is around when they're sick, who picks them up from school, whose house they sleep at, whose photos are framed in the living room. They feel the hierarchy, even if no one speaks it aloud. And here's the cruel irony. The more the paternal grandmother tries to bridge the gap, bringing gifts, offering help, calling often, the more her presence can be seen as intrusive rather than supportive. Her efforts, meant to create closeness, may actually reinforce the invisible boundary. This emotional triangle becomes even more complex when there's tension between the parents. In cases of divorce, conflict, or distance, the paternal grandmother's bond often becomes collateral damage. She may lose access not because of anything she did, but because the father's presence weakens, and with it, her bridge to the child. Freud believed that unresolved dynamics from our own childhoods often repeat in the next generation. A woman who felt judged by her mother-in-law may unconsciously exclude her once she becomes a mother. A man who grew up watching his mother be distant or critical may not fight hard to include her in his child's life. The past echoes in the present, whether we recognize it or not. So what can be done? Healing begins with awareness. If you are a paternal grandmother, know that your value is not diminished by distance. Your love matters, even if it isn't always seen. If you are a mother, ask yourself, am I making space for connection or guarding old wounds? And if you are a father, remember, you are the bridge. Your effort can restore balance in this emotional triangle. In the next part, we'll explore the long-term consequences of this divide and what happens to a child raised without meaningful connection to one whole side of their heritage. What happens to a child when an entire relationship quietly disappears, when birthday parties no longer include a familiar face, when the voice that once sang lullabies becomes just an echo in the background? This is the hidden loss in many modern families, a relationship that fades not because of death, but because of emotional distance. And when the paternal grandmother is gradually removed or sidelined, the child doesn't just lose a grandparent, they lose a piece of themselves. Let's be clear. Children are resilient. They can thrive in all kinds of family dynamics, but resilience doesn't mean indifference. Children notice who's missing. They notice who doesn't come around anymore, who used to call but now doesn't, who is only spoken of in passing, or not at all. This absence, especially when unexplained, creates confusion, and children often blame themselves for the things they don't understand. Maybe she didn't like me. Maybe I wasn't good enough. These thoughts aren't spoken, but they sink in, softly, silently, shaping the child's sense of worth and belonging. Freud once said that our early relationships create the blueprint for how we understand love, abandonment, and connection. If a child feels a grandparent has drifted away, they may unconsciously associate love with distance, that the people who once held them close can one day disappear without explanation. And the emotional ripple doesn't stop there. Many paternal grandmothers hold not just personal love, but cultural memory. They are often the link to the father's family history, traditions, values, and even language. Their stories contain ancestral knowledge. Their kitchens echo with the recipes passed down for generations. Their hands carry the gestures and rituals that define where the child comes from. When this connection is lost, the child grows up with only half of their roots visible. They may know their mother's side intimately, the relatives, the traditions, the emotional landscape, but the father's side becomes a blur. Names without stories, faces without warmth. This absence can later show up as identity confusion, especially in adolescence and adulthood. Why don't I know anything about Dad's family? Why did Grandma stop visiting? Why do I feel like something's missing? And sometimes it isn't just cultural memory that's lost, it's emotional anchoring. Grandparents play a unique psychological role. They provide love without the pressure of discipline. They offer consistency when parents are overwhelmed. They become safe havens during chaos. And when a child loses access to one of them, especially because of family conflict, they lose an ally they didn't even know they had. In therapy, adult clients often recall a missing grandparent with a mixture of confusion and quiet grief. They remember feeling loved, then abandoned. They remember visits that abruptly stopped. They carry unresolved questions that no one ever answered. Sometimes the father, caught in the middle, doesn't have the words or the strength to explain. Other times, the mother's silence becomes the family's silence, and the child is left to fill the blanks with their own assumptions. Even more tragic is when the narrative becomes distorted. She never tried to see you. She didn't care. She was always difficult. These statements, spoken in frustration or passed down over time, become the child's only version of the story. They grow up believing a grandparent rejected them, when the truth might be far more complicated. Of course, not all paternal grandmothers are saints. Some overstep, criticize, or bring genuine tension. But we must separate behavior from presence. A difficult relationship doesn't always require severance. It requires boundaries, communication, and effort. And when possible, maintaining some connection is worth it for the child's sake. Because here's the truth. Relationships don't need to be perfect to be valuable. A grandparent doesn't have to be flawless to offer love, stability, and heritage. Sometimes, just knowing that someone else cares deeply about them can anchor a child through the storms of life. So what can families do? If you're a mother who finds it difficult to relate to your partner's mother, ask yourself, can I make room for respectful connection, even if it's imperfect? Can I prioritize the child's bond over my personal discomfort? If you're a father caught between two women you love, your mother and your partner, don't disappear. Be the bridge. Advocate for respectful inclusion. Your silence may feel safe, but it often becomes a choice against connection. And if you're a grandmother who feels pushed out, know this, your story is still unfolding. Even a delayed connection can be meaningful. Keep your heart open, but also respect the boundaries being asked of you. You don't need to force your way in. You only need to stay present enough that, when the door opens again, the child knows you never truly left. In the final section, we'll explore the path to healing, how families can reclaim broken bonds, rewrite inherited scripts, and teach the next generation that love doesn't have to choose sides. Every family holds its own myths. Some are spoken, others are silent, stitched between holidays and absences, woven into glances and phone calls never made. And one of the most painful myths is this, that once a family bond is broken, it must stay broken. That silence must be honored like a tombstone. That absence becomes a new normal. But what if that isn't true? Carl Jung believed that healing does not happen by rejecting the past, but by confronting it with consciousness. In family systems, this means acknowledging the pain, but also making space for possibility. It means letting go of inherited roles, like the meddling mother-in-law or the controlling wife, and seeing the humans beneath the labels. In many families, the grandmother's exile isn't just the result of conflict, it's the product of projection. The daughter-in-law may unconsciously project her own unresolved issues with her own mother onto her husband's mother. The son may avoid emotional confrontation because it triggers memories of past powerlessness. The grandmother herself may reenact patterns from her own family of origin, overcompensating, overreaching, or withdrawing. And the child, unknowingly, becomes the battleground for ghosts. This is where conscious intervention matters. Reconciliation isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering with clarity. It's about choosing dialogue over assumption, curiosity over blame, boundaries over punishment. But how does that begin? It starts with the adults, with the courage to say what was never said, to ask questions that feel dangerous but necessary. Why did we cut contact? What was I afraid of? Did we protect the child or punish each other through the child? These questions aren't easy. They bring up shame, regret, and grief. But they also create space for something new to be born. A mother might admit, I felt judged, and I didn't know how to protect myself without cutting ties. A father might confess, I chose peace over truth, and in doing so, I hurt you both. A grandmother might reflect, I pushed too hard. I wanted to be needed, and I didn't know how to step back with grace. These are not admissions of failure. They are acts of bravery. Psychologically, we call this differentiation, the process of seeing each family member as a whole, separate being, not just a role. The mother is not just the gatekeeper. The grandmother is not just the intruder. The father is not just the neutral middle. They are people with wounds, needs, and histories, doing their best, often blindly. Once this shift happens, the path to reconnection becomes clearer. Maybe it starts with a letter, a small holiday gift, a photo sent to say, I'm thinking of you. It doesn't have to be dramatic, it just has to be intentional. And if the past is too painful for full reconnection, there's still healing and acknowledgement, saying, we may not be close, but I appreciate what you once gave. Or, I hope you know you're still part of his story. Because here's what children learn from all this, not just who loves them, but how love survives imperfection. They learn that relationships can be messy and still meaningful, that people can disagree and still care, that history doesn't have to equal destiny. When we model forgiveness, not naive reconciliation, but grounded compassion, we teach the next generation resilience, emotional maturity, the power to break cycles instead of repeating them. In some cases, it's the child themselves, now grown, who reopens the door. Why don't I know my grandmother? What really happened? These questions, when met with truth instead of shame, can become bridges. Jung believed that we inherit not just eye color and genes, but psychological burdens. He called them ancestral shadows, wounds passed down unconsciously. But with awareness, they can be transformed. A father who couldn't speak to his own mother may raise a child who learns to speak truth without fear. A grandmother, once pushed away, may become the storyteller the grandchild never knew they needed. A family that once fractured may grow again, crooked but alive. And sometimes the healing is symbolic. Lighting a candle for a grandmother not present. Telling her stories, even if she's no longer in your life. Holding space for both the love and the hurt. That, too, is a form of reconciliation. Because at the end of the day, this story isn't just about grandmothers. It's about all the ways we navigate love, loyalty, and legacy. About how we hold each other, and how, sometimes, we must learn to let each other in again. So if you're reading this and see yourself in any part of the triangle, mother, father, or grandmother, ask yourself, what story have I inherited? What role have I played too long? And what truth am I finally ready to speak? Because healing doesn't come from blame. It comes from bravery. And sometimes, the most radical thing we can do is pick up the phone.